I use a very simple econometric model that uses Kentucky wages and salary as the independent variable. I ran that model and it was essentially flat. It was predicting a flat fourth quarter, and we have already seen in April a 7.5% decline in withholding receipts, and I expect that number, that decline, to get even larger in May and June. So I thought that the standard model that we use for control was too optimistic, and so I replaced it with the April forecast, the 7.5% growth rate, and I duplicated that for May and June to give us a flat growth rate, or I'm sorry, a plain decline of 7.5% for the entire quarter. The withholding pessimistic forecast is the normal regression model that I use. The declarations forecast, I've got 20% of declarers who stop entirely in the fourth quarter. They go from their normal declaration payment amount to 0 payments. And then there's another segment of the declarers, approximately 20%, who experience a 25% reduction in business. This is how I modeled it, and they will pay 75% of what they would have, for a net effect for all of declarations of minus 25% for the fourth quarter. Net returns uses the same methodology as I have in the past, but I made an adjustment for the receipts that we received, or I should say the refund requests that were received in April. That was a net of minus $8 million for April. Normally we would expect between $70 to $80 million in our April net returns, but this year I believe that we will receive all of the pay side of that account in July. Fourth quarter 2019, we got a net of $29 million. So I'm saying that we're going to get almost the same amount in this fourth quarter. Fiduciary uses the same methodology as we used in December also. Accidentally skipped the slide. There we go. If you've ever looked at our needs report, this will look familiar to you. The orange, yellow, and green sections are a document that we call the needs report. The light blue section I added to this to give you a clearer understanding of what my forecast really is. That is the fourth quarter estimate that I'm presenting today. And you can contrast that with the green section. So let me go over these each of these pieces separately. The light blue section is my estimates for the fourth quarter alone. The light orange section shows that the fourth quarter estimate plus the 3 quarters of actual show the full FY20 growth rate. The yellow section shows what happened in April and the year-to-dates. The green section shows the needs for May and June to meet this new estimate. The growth rates in the far right column can be a little bit misleading, and that's because some of the money that was supposed to come in April didn't come in April. So we're really comparing a FY19 April to no activity that happened in this year April. So those growth rates can be misleading because they're trying to compare year-to-date to year-to-dates. Go back to the blue section for a moment. This is really what I'm asking, I'm displaying for today for my forecast model. You can see that overall for individual income tax, it's a minus 11.2% change. That's $151 million. With withholding declining by 7.5%, this is again the control scenario. And the declarations, net returns, and fiduciary for both the control and the pessimistic are the same, so that you'll see them in the next slide, they'll be the same. So declarations, I'm expecting to decline by a net 25%, that's $67 million. Net returns, the position will improve by 13%, that's a decline of $3.9 million. Fiduciary is declining by $1.6 million. Here's the pessimistic. You can see that the withholding has fallen from 7.5% to 10.6%. That's a decline of $111 million for withholding. And the declarations, net returns, and fiduciary are the same. Last year in declarations fourth quarter, we got $267 million. So you can see there's the $67 million decline. That's all I have for individual. If there's any questions.
Dr. Bartlett? Bartley does have some questions.
Sure.
Thank you. So just to make sure, because that I'm following your methodology, because I assume in the end we're going to end up in the Excel spreadsheets where we can look at the control and the pessimistic and blends and so on. So I just want to, since this is the biggest category, I want to make sure. So for your control, since we were down 7.5% for April, you're assuming that we're going to have 7.5% in May,
And
less
June.
than May last year, and 7.5% in June from June of last year. Is that right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, and if we do that, if we go back one slide, if we do that, you're saying that the whole IIT will be positive of 0.3% compared to the year before. Is that right?
Correct, and that's of course based on the fact that the first 3 quarters were very strong.
Yes. Okay. So then if we go to the pessimistic, your methodology, you say same as our December meeting. So
That's
how
correct.
does that mean as far as what you expect for growth rates in May and June?
The pessimistic forecast has May and June going down by somewhat more than 7.5%. So the declines accelerate.
Okay, but you don't have actual numbers. So that you mentioned the 7.5% for May and June under the control, but I just want to make sure I'm not missing something. You don't. It's in the model, but it's not in the sheet here of how much that decrease is in May and June of this year under the pessimistic model.
Correct, in that it's a quarterly model.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
All right. If there's no other questions, I'll move on to coal, which should be brief. I run literally hundreds of models every time I do this forecast every quarter. And incidentally, this is the exact same model specification that I presented in December, and it's the same model specification that I used the quarter before that for the quarterly report. So this is very familiar to you. I have the forecasts for the 4 regressors here. You can see the forecast going forward, and in each of all 4 of the independent variables, the forecast is declining in price of oil and real GDP declining sharply. And I'm spending so little time on this because the difference between the 2 forecasts, the control and the pessimistic, are almost imperceptible. It's $13,000 difference between the pessimistic and the control. I'm indifferent between the 2. My only real feeling is that because this model does include real GDP, I am against using the pessimistic model, even though it is irrelevant for purposes of the coal severance forecast and tax receipts. My feeling is that minus 23% peak to trough decline in real GDP is unrealistic, and if I were to forecast this going with a much larger time horizon, I would not feel that the pessimistic scenario would be adequate. But for this short time horizon, the 2 forecasts are almost identical. That's all I have for coal.
All right, this is Greg Harkenauer back again to talk about the sales and use tax. It's our 2nd largest general fund revenue source. So let me go ahead. I'm starting with the end, actually. I've got the forecast on the front page rather than the last page. Versus the enacted, which is the 4129.8. The May control is 3967.1. So it's down 162.7 million from the enacted estimate, which was the pessimistic estimate. And the May pessimistic number is 3931.6, which is down 198.2 million from the enacted estimate. As Michael said, the consumption sector is by Global Insight is really expected to tank, and all the regressors that I used took that into account. So with that, I'm gonna tell you a little bit on how I updated the model. Year-to-date growth was 6.7% through March, and the needs in the fourth quarter were 5.8%. We're in the middle of a turning point, and in case nobody's told you yet today, turning points are difficult. Goes without saying. We reran the structural models that we used in December. Did not rerun the ARIMA and the VAR that we used because I don't think they're appropriate for a one-quarter forecast in the middle of a turning point, so I use structural models. We're still using that policy neutral series as a dependent variable because of the tax reform. And on the structural models, I used U.S. state and local personal taxes. I use consumer spending, both the durable equation and the non-durable equation. And I also use Kentucky wages and salaries in a univariate model, and that was a quite negative experience. When you do the policy neutral series, you have to add back the effects of tax reform like we did in December. But what we did in December, the add backs have changed because remember the add backs were for the expansion in tax reform, which were mainly an expansion of the services that we used. And a lot of the services, a good bit of the number of services that were added back in 2018 were dormant for a good part of the fourth quarter of fiscal 20. I mean, we're halfway through it, and things that were added like admissions, greens fees, tanning beds, pet grooming, etc., have not really been open for business a lot of the fourth quarter. So normally in the fourth quarter, we add back about $80.2 million was my add factor when we did it in December. My add back when I did it in April and also in May was about $50 million. So we took away some of the add back for policy impacts due to the fact that those services weren't gonna be open. So really, what you have in terms of, I talked about the differences between the official and the May estimates being down 162 and 198. It comes from two sources. One of the sources is the change in the forecast of the exogenous variables, which took my structural models down and led to a lower projected, a lower value on my regression models. And secondly, once I got the policy neutral series forecasted, I added back less money. So it's really a situation where there's two things dragging the sales tax forecast down. I did not explicitly use the data from April except to help calibrate the effects of tax reform and to fine-tune the estimates a little bit. Again, there was no new observations on the economic side because we used the April global insight for both the interim estimates and the May estimates, and we didn't have a new quarter of revenue data. We just had 1 month, and it was inappropriate to do an ARIMA from that 1 month. So that's how I came up with the estimates both for the interim report and for the May forecast. So what I wanted to do was, since we only have 2 months to go, I wanted to really drill down and dig deep into the fourth quarter to see if the estimates coming out of these models were realistic. So I looked at the fourth quarter from last year, fiscal 19. Sales tax grew 11.5% in the fourth quarter last year. April grew 12.3%. Remember, this year it declined 6.5%. May grew 16.8%. So May is going to be a big hurdle to get over. And June grew 5.9%, which was a little bit below the annual growth in the sales tax, but it was still a healthy month with $341.8 million in gross collections. So What do we know about the fourth quarter? Well, not much. We know that April was 340.6 million, which is pretty good considering that we had 12.3% growth last year. I was very happy with that. I was happy until I started thinking about it. April receipts are primarily March retail sales. And, you know, when you're sitting in April looking at the month, you're thinking to yourself, why aren't the sales tax going down further? But then you remember it's March retail sales. And March was a split month in terms of economic reaction to the COVID virus. So the 6.5% decline I expect to get worse in May and June. In terms of disaggregated data I get from the Department of Revenue, the top 20 sales tax failures were actually up 9.4%. And information from Revenue indicated that some of the top payers were industries or stores that would be associated with stockpiling essentials, and they said to expect that to level off. Another thing that brought up April sales was the marketplace provider thing that we do to collect sales tax from out-of-state providers. That was $14.2 million in April, which is the second highest month ever. And another thing that I've asked the Department of Revenue to track for me when the COVID thing started was I asked them to follow restaurant, hotels, and admissions to entertainment venues and so forth. And those were down $25.9 million in April, which is March activity, 27% drop. I expect that category to get a lot worse when you have April and May activity because we've just witnessed April and May, and they've been slow months for those three industries. So I expect the drop in those by more than 27% in the last 2 months of the fiscal year. So really, I'm going to talk about the control. On my final slide, I'm going to talk about. I trust the methodology that I used, and I believe it to be a good methodology. But just to do a sanity check, we've got April in the bag, so I want to look at what we need for May and June to hit the estimates. So the May control estimate for the fourth quarter is $880.5 million, or a 15.8% decline. April's in the bank at 6.4%, so that means the needs for May and June are nominally $539.6 million, or we can have a 20.8% decline in the sales tax and still hit the control estimate. So that was my sanity check. Do I believe it's going to fall 20.8%? Yeah, I think that's in the realm of possibility. Given the fact that April was based on March activity, I think that May and June, especially with the high hurdles that we have to get over, 20.8% is a reasonable amount for those 2 months to decline. So just to double check against, to make sure that the model is producing something that's reasonable. For the pessimistic, the forecast for the fourth quarter is $845 million, which is a 19.2% decline. April receipts were the same, 340.9, so the needs for May and June are 504.1 million, or a 26% decline. Do I believe a 26% decline? That's probably on the high end of what I think things are going to decline, but that's sort of what the model kicked out. And could it happen? Sure, it could happen. It's not out of the realm of possibility. So I just put this slide up here to show what we need in the last 2 months of the year to hit the estimates that were provided by the model. And the range is 20.8% decline to 26% decline. And given what was presented by Dr. Michael Jones on the economic section, talking about consumption and wages and salaries, personal income and stuff, those seem like reasonable estimates to me. So that's really all I have for the sales tax. If there's any questions on the sales tax, I'll take them. Otherwise, I'll turn over to Gene Brown for the corporate and property tax estimates.
And then I will go through the property tax as well. So looking quickly at the progression of the forecasts, when we left here in December, we left with the optimistic forecast of $636.7 million, or a decline of 16.5%. Now the official enacted number is 581. The April interim forecast that I produced for the quarterly report that came out at the end of April was $473 million, or a decline of 37.9%. So that forecast continued to go down. The May forecast that I'm going to talk about today is an increase relative to the April interim forecast. And so today what I'll do is I'll talk about change, how I got to my May forecast from the April interim forecast. First let me talk about the April forecast. I forecasted that in the same way that I always do, using a structural model with before tax profits, made adjustments for prior legislation. And for the May forecast, it's basically accounting changes. So let's take a look. So the April IHS forecast called for another significant drop in corporate profits, over 38%. And the next point, I did make an adjustment for tax reform for prior years. Now, I had done that previously. I have that in there just to remind myself that I used the same steps that I'd done before. After I made my the forecast, the needs for May and June would be $49.8 million. That's relative to the interim estimate, which would be a decline of 66%. However, when we take into account that the returns and estimated payments that were due in April have been extended into July, we knew that at the time of the April forecast, but that we would leave the books open to collect any of that money that came in during the first half of July would be credited back to this fiscal year. That's part of the reason, that's the main reason for the increase relative to the April forecast. So I increased the forecast in May compared to April by $67 million. Unfortunately, that's not a rigorous number, but let's look at this quick. So the needs for May and June, when we looked at in the interim forecast, we would need to collect $49.8 million. In April, we collected $52 million, which is a decline of 70% from the prior April. My revision was $67 million to that April forecast, which left us with a new needs of $116 million, or a decline of 20.3%. Now that decline seems awfully small, but you have to recall that because we're going to leave the books open, we're essentially getting, in May and June, we're getting nearly one extra month of collections. We're getting that April collections that are going to come in technically in July, but it will be credited back to April. So we always talk about the difficulty of looking at declarations and net returns in the LLET receipts. We forecast them all as a single amount because there is some kind of, it's not clear exactly which bucket the money is in, but I think in this case, it's okay to look at this, particularly on the corporate returns. They were down $64.9 million in April relative to last year. So now we're going to get some of that money is going to come in July. We're not going to get it all because originally, if you recall, our forecast when we left in December was for a decline of over 16% in the corporate tax. So we're not gonna get all of that. Some of those corporate declarations, the $38.6 million, the shortfall, some of that's gonna come in, but we're not gonna get all of that. Some of that money, is gonna come in after the books have closed. Some of that's because of the lower profitability. So it was basically a case of kind of eyeballing, what we think we may get in the, first 2 weeks of July that's gonna be credited back, and this is where I came up with the $67 million. Now, in terms of the pessimistic forecast, under the interim forecast for May and June, the needs would have been $14.9 million, or nearly 90% decline. April receipts again were $52 million, and I added $50 million to that for new needs of 64.9%. Now, unfortunately, when we look at what's happening in the current month, it's not a lot of help to us. May is a small month for the corporate tax receipts. Last year we got $10 million in May and about $140 million in June. So it's really gonna come down to what happens in June. So whatever we've seen so far this month is not giving us a lot of indication of what receipts are gonna do. So if we compare the two forecasts, under the control, we would be $40.8 million under the official estimate. The pessimistic would be $92.7 million less. And then the needs, again, for the last 2 months of the year under the control, a decline of 20.3%, and the pessimistic, a decline of $55.7 million. Again, it's important to keep in mind that we will be receiving a fair amount of that April money that is going to be collected in July that's going to come back into this fiscal year. And that's all I have on the corporate. Is there any questions? Okay, so on the property tax, through March, collections were strong. We had increased 3.5% year-to-date. That was 90% of the official forecast. April revenue was down 39.5%, primarily due to the tangible property. The majority of that is going to be the motor vehicle property tax. So that's really what we collect in the final quarter. Most of the property tax comes in the first 3 quarters. We get about $75 million in the final quarter. So the official enacted, we only did one property tax forecast when we were here in December. That was $657.1 million. The interim forecast was only slightly lower. And then the May forecast I went ahead and did a pessimistic, and I lowered it primarily due to the impact of the motor vehicle usage tax. So why didn't I have a big change in the interim forecast from the official? Well, the idea was, even though the county clerks, well, first, motor vehicle property tax is paid when you do your registration renewal. It's all on the same card. The county clerk's offices were closed for in-person visits, but you could still pay that tax through a variety of ways. In Woodford County, for instance, they have a drop box out front. You could mail it in. You could do renewals by phone. The transportation cabinet has a website where you can renew your registration there, and then that would be the property tax would be paid at the same time. Now, taxpayers were given a 90-day extension for that as well. And so my original thought was, well, with all these methods of paying, and that when the county clerk's offices opened up, we'd be able to collect that before the end of the quarter or the end of the fiscal year. But we saw earlier this week that Fayette County has announced the county clerk's office is not going to open until July. And even when they do open, there's going to be a lag in collecting that money. I'm sure they would have reduced staff You're not gonna have long lines of people in the, county clerk's office waiting. It'll probably be a couple of people at a time, so there's gonna be a lag in collecting that money. So under the two, forecasts, the control would be $15.2 million less than the official enacted. The pessimistic would be $24.7 million less. And so for the last two quarters, or the last 2 months, the needs would be a decline of 32.2%, under the control of 53.7% for the pessimistic. That's property tax. If there are no questions, Greg will finish out with the cigarette tax and I believe the miscellaneous taxes.
Well, thank you, I'm back. We got about $1.2 million of general fund to get over, but we should get over it pretty quickly because a lot of these taxes aren't changing very much. On the cigarette tax, year-to-date cigarette tax is pretty much flat, 0.2%, and that's through the month of April. So that's 10 months of flatness, 0.2%. That is better actually than we forecasted in December. We thought we'd have a bigger consumption decline due to the national rate of decline. We expected that to prevail in Kentucky, but it just hasn't panned out that way. We're flat for the year, 0.2%. Last couple months have been kind of squirrely. March was up 52.5%. We expect some hoarding was going on there at the beginning of the pandemic. April was down 21.1% compared to the prior year. But that's sort of typical for the cigarette tax. We've had big swings all fiscal year, but in the end, it's always been around zero. So essentially, I'm forecasting 2 months on the cigarette tax. So I looked at last year, what we got in May and what we got in June. Last May was up 67.9%, which you think that was a whopper month, but not really, because fiscal 19 grew 66.9%. Because we raised the tax rate from 60 cents a pack to $1.10 a pack. So last year, all the months grew very strongly. So May was sort of a normal month, and June was sort of I would say a weakish month, being that the annual monthly average was 66.9, and we only grew 36.1 in June. So I expect the end of fiscal 20 to be about flat. 1.4 for May and June, and percent growth in May and June for the control. And I did a pessimistic just because I was in a frisky mood, I guess. So negative 3.4% for the pessimistic scenario on the cigarette tax. But like I say, it's essentially flat. If you look at the estimates we did in December, we estimated 344.9 million, or 2.4% drop from the prior year. And the April interim is not important. The May control we said was 340 is going to be 354.9, or right around flat, 0.4% growth. And the May pessimistic is 352, or negative 0.4%. So you're talking about a swing of $2.9 million between the control and the pessimistic. And it's hard to determine with a tax that has such wild monthly swings which way it's going to go, but we're not talking about a lot of money. 2.9 million difference between the control and the pessimistic. I will say, however, that it is going to be higher than the official estimate, 344.9 million. That seems like a sure thing. So that's one tax that's actually gone up from the official estimate. Unless there's questions about cigarettes, we'll go over the lottery. Lottery has been impacted greatly by what's going on. We work with Howard Klein, the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the Kentucky Lottery Corporation. Work with him. He approves the dividends and so forth that come back to the Commonwealth. And we had a long discussion about April sales and what's going to be happening for the end of the fiscal year. And a lot of the Kentucky Lottery Corporation retailers had closed up or reduced hours significantly, which brought down sales. On the closure side, the biggest impact was on Keno. Sales were down 4.2 million or 48.8% in April. As it turns out, the Mega Millions and Powerball dividends, current financial market conditions have raised the cost of financing jackpots. So jackpots have been lower, and lower jackpots mean lower play. So we did have a $3.9 million reduction in the mega online games. The Powerball and the Mega Millions were down 3.9 or 40% in the month of April. And we expect weakness in the rest of the year for Powerball and Mega Millions unless we get an unforetold run in the jackpot. So really, the slowdown in retail activity has really hurt the lottery. What we're saying now is that the dividend's going to be $262.4 million. $262.4 million is $8.6 million less than the official estimate, which is $271 million. But it's 7% or 7.0 million more than we thought in the April estimate. We had a conversation after the April estimate, and things weren't quite as bad in April as they feared they could be. So they raised the estimate by $7 million from April to May. So we're pretty happy about that. The 262.4 is our new estimate for fiscal 20. It's less than enacted, but more than we budgeted. We budgeted 256, and we're getting 262.4. So we're in pretty good shape on the lottery, notwithstanding the COVID crisis. So those are the expected dividends for the rest of the year. Miscellaneous taxes, a lot of action in miscellaneous taxes, but as you can see from the green and the pink area, not much difference between April and May. I did go through every single account in the miscellaneous ledger to look for changes. I will say that it is down from the enacted estimate, anywhere from $8 to $9 million down. May was slightly better than April, and let me see here. Turn my notes. Yeah, it's just a $1 million difference, and I didn't do a difference between control and pessimistic because I just did point estimates on all the. I think there's 86 accounts, and the other